right, welcome back for another edition of The Final Mile, where we answer your questions, whether they come through the website or our Facebook group or any other social media outlets. Ben and I are here to answer your questions, and we've got 5 good ones today. But please make sure to check out our sponsors in the description box or the show notes if you're on YouTube, or the podcast notes if you're on audio only, and support your boys in the channel. So, all right, our first question, Ben, comes from Irene. She asks, do you need a TMS when you start as a freight broker? I feel like we've gotten this question a handful of times about, like, do I need a TMS? Do I need a CRM? Do I need X, Y, and Z? And I think that, like, the answer is no, you don't need one, but you should have one, right? We've got a couple of partners with Rose Rocket and Ascend TMS that you can get a freemium version, check it out for a month, and decide if you want to buy it or not. But what do you think about that? Could you imagine trying to do your job without the software?
No. And what I want to do is take a minute to explain why this is the case, right? Just briefly, right? Like, as Nate pointed out, you can absolutely do this without one. In fact, people did this for decades before TMSs even really came into existence. And even as late as I came into the industry, 10 some years ago, like, I still talk to people that were at that time moving loads and invoicing things and doing them with paper and didn't have a TMS. I would say that if you're concerned about the cost, which is the number one reason why people don't get a TMS, as Nate pointed out, you can get free versions or close to it, right? Ascend, you can absolutely get a free version. Rose Rocket has a freemium version. And as you do more business, you can work your way into a paid version. Now, why, if you're not worried about cost, should you still use this, right? And again, and I just did this again recently, even with, we're talking about bringing on more people into my brokerage and things. And the ones I've used, I've liked because I know how to use the tools and I know what I like to see interface wise. And for me, preference is speed, right? As a broker, you're on the phone. You need to be able to find things very quickly, convey that information back to your customer, and be able to do this without it taking a lot of minutes. Remember, the person you're talking to is in a hurry, probably needs to get this done, needs an update sometimes on a few things at once. If you are trying to do that with paper or just Excel or any other system, it is very, very difficult. And I can tell you unequivocally, you will make mistakes. Yeah. And in addition to you making mistakes, they're very costly, right? You send a truck, doesn't have the right address, the wrong PO, the wrong pickup number. You will end up with 10 times more work than you need, which I think is a really big one.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead and finish up. I got some thoughts on it too.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, if you add on that, because the other thing I was going to say is, and this is another reason why I really like Ascend and Rose Rocket, right? So again, the reason I had said I've used other TMSs and even personally prefer some that are a little different, it's because I do different types of business, containers, different numbers, and the way the business moves, it just kind of fits the way I do it. Now, for somebody new, right? If I'm going to train somebody into how to actually be a freight broker or how to do this business, what is great about Ascend and Rose Rocket is that there's a really better way to put it, kind of idiot proofs the job, right?
It does.
It forces you to go through the steps you need to go through in order to complete it. So you can't skip them. And the drop downs at which, again, if you've taken our course or any course and you're learning it, it is a great tool to reinforce what you've maybe learned once or twice or were explained a few times. You need to see these things over and over and over to get proficient and effective at them and to be really good at the other parts of the job you need to. You do not want to be spending all of your time learning these systems, obviously, but they're great and they are very, again, for lack of a better explanation, dumbed down to somebody that doesn't know the industry that well. You kind of have to go through it, like the life cycle of a load. Which stage are you in? Oh, this load doesn't have a carrier on it. Well, guess what I need to do? Find a carrier, right? If you're in some of these other systems, like, they don't always do that. So you do need to know what to do kind of to use them. Ascend and I think Rose Rocket are very good because they force you to go through the 101 level of what you need to do in every situation. You don't have to look at other ways. You don't have to call other people. It kind of just takes you through it.
I think the benefit too, like, so I don't personally use either of those. We looked at an upgrade on one a couple years ago. We've been on McLeod at my brokerage for a while. McLeod's just extremely expensive, and it's not. Well, the reason that we picked it is based on having a trucking company as well. It's got an asset module, and we've customized it over the years to really work both sides of the business, asset and brokerage, very, very well. And we've talked with Tim from Ascend TMS, and he's just straight up. He's like, we're not designed for a big brokerage. We're designed for small to medium sized folks. We're not super customizable. I mean, whatever one person gets, every single user gets. They're not going to make specific customizations for one company. And he said it right. Like their free version you can check out. He's like, it's like driving a car with no doors, no windshield, and then you pay and it's under $100 a month and you get the full, the full car. And my thought is, trying to be a freight broker without a TMS is like saying, well, can I get from Buffalo to Atlanta on a bike? Well, sure, you can, but the preferred method is probably going to be an airplane, if not a car, depending on a variety of factors. But you're not going to ride your bike or walk. You can start without a TMS, but you really need to have one. You should have one. So good discussion on it. All right, next one up is from Sayge. Sayge asks, how would you rate a 1-pick 10-drop reefer load? I like this question because I remember it was probably like 8 years ago, the first time I saw a multi-stop load. I was like, well, what do you do here? You have to like kind of put yourself in the driver's shoes, right? They're not just looking at total mileage. There's a hassle factor that goes with having to stop at 10 different places to unload your truck. It takes time. It's frustrating. You might be dealing with multiple lumber companies. The way I've always done it is you kind of have a per stop, an extra rate per stop associated. So maybe an extra $50 per stop along the way, right? And so what you would do is take your total mileage and have your fair, reasonable rate per mile, and then you add on and you give an all-in rate to your driver, and you can explain like, hey, I've factored in an extra $50 for hassle factor at each stop. It's maybe about an hour, 2 hours of your time at each one. And you got to talk to your customer too about how that all looks, right? Hey, the reason that this costs more than if it was just 1-pick 1-drop is, one, it takes more time, but two, this is a lot of work and frustration for a driver. What's your take on the multi-stop loads?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. They're often referred to by shippers as milk runs. You'll hear that.
Yep.
That verbiage where you're talking to a customer, hey, I got a couple milk runs. And again, think about it more from the driver's point of view when you're rating this, right? Drivers make money on a per mile basis when their wheels are moving, right? So they are not being paid when they are waiting to unload while they're unloading and then getting ready to leave again, right? So all that is idle time, meaning they're not really generating any money. And it's a lot of time. If you got 2 hours or 3 hours to unload, that is going to cost more per stop than if it is a hour to unload. They're super quick to get the guy in and get him right back out the door, right? So those are what the carrier is looking at and what they're trying to determine on what they can actually need to charge or what it would cost to run one of these, right? So again, a simple way to do it is I take the first pick and if you have, my mind just blanked. What is the rating software where you can put all the drops in and it will route them?
PC Miler.
Yeah, PC Miler is a great one. You put in all the stops and it will route it and give you the miles on it. The hard thing is like you also then need to take that mileage, and I usually will pick the rate per mile from just the pick to the delivery because you'll clearly have more miles. And then you multiply that and then you add up all the, take the number like Nate said. Again, that number will vary depending on what Nate just said is the questions of your shipper. How long to unload? How long's the wait time? Is there any detention there? How often does that happen? That's going to determine if you're at $50 a stop or maybe at $100 or $150 a stop, because that's really what the carrier is looking at. It's like, okay, well, I'm not making money while I'm unloading, so I need to make sure that I'm not running other loads, obviously, on a 1-pick 1 like what it normally be. This might take all week to run one of these, right? So again, the formula.
I want to give an example, like to literally put that into to visualize it or think about it here. Let's say you're 1-pick 10 drops. You look up the PC Miler or whatever routing software you got, and it's 1,000 miles, right? And let's say you then take your first pick and your last drop, and you run that rate, right? Maybe it's in rate view or whatever, and you get an average of $2 a mile, right? Now it's not 1,000 miles from point A all the way to the end, but the total of all the stops is going to be 1,000 miles. So we want to apply that $2 a mile times the total, $2,000, and then maybe I'm going to add in an extra $500 for the additional stops, right? And that's how you would go about doing it. What some people, they overthink is, well, I have to run point A to B and then B to C and C to D. That you don't. Because at the end of the day, the driver cares about where they're going to end up empty and have to find their next load. They don't care about the stops along the way as long as they're getting paid for them. So it's a good question, though. So in this case, specifically 10 drops, they're probably not going to be super long unloading times. It's probably like 2 to 3 pallets each. But who knows? Good question, though. All right, next up, my non-compete is up next month. Where do I go from here if I want to be 1099? And there was no name associated, I'm assuming, because this person is still under their non-compete. They don't want their information out there. So what I would do is, there's really two things. You got to line up where you're going to go work, and then you got to go get in touch with all your old customers. Okay, so let's say you had a 6-month non-compete, you're 5 months in, you get ready to start up. I'm going to go out there, and any recruiter I've talked with or any company that I've had a relationship or discussion with, and then do some research too, right? If you want to go the 1099 route and be somebody's sub-agent or an agent directly for a broker, go out there and network with those different companies and figure out what's the best fit for you, right? It's not all about how much commission's being paid. There's things like, how do they treat you? How do they, when do they pay you? How often do they pay you? Do they have the right insurance to handle your customers' kind of freight? Stuff like that. So definitely vet out the brokerage, and then you've got to have conversations with your customers. Though I've seen too many times, Ben, where someone's like, and they've come to my company, Pierce, and they've got, hey, I just rated out my non-compete. I'm going to build my book of business back up. And they were way overconfident about the relationship. And they're like, yeah, we're still good. I still talk to these people all the time, right? We're buddies. And then they go to onboard them, and it's like, well, yeah, you're still buddies, but they've got a new broker that they've been working with for the last year. So
that's the big thing I think people really don't understand, right? Is it how competitive the market really is, right? And it's, if you aren't literally moving that freight right now and it's still moving, somebody else is moving it, right? Mm-hmm. So again, even if you've got the relationship, you've got to be worked back in. It's not going to usually just be, oh, hey, the guy I worked with forever is now going to get all the business that the other company's been doing for a week or two. And again, if this has been a few months, there are other relationships, there's other carriers, there's other rates, and all of the market has shifted, including your own carrier base, right? Like, I've also seen brokers are like, oh yeah, I ran this account for years. I haven't done it for 3 or 4 months. I'll give them a call. They'll give me the business back. Well, even if they do give it, right, like, all of your carriers have now taken other freight, moved other lanes, are doing different routes, may or may not be able to give you the same rates and capacity that you had before. So it's not just the business, it's also the carrier side too. So, like, again, doesn't mean it's not doable, but it is not a flip of a switch thing, I would point out.
And the other thing too is, non-compete could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, right? If you're more on the 1 to 2 year side and you don't know what the market's like right now, I would highly recommend, if you're thinking about getting back in, call some people that are brokering right now and ask them, how is it different than it was 2 years ago or a year ago or whatever the case might be? Because it is different right now. Good question, though. All right, next up, I'm looking to transition from a small fleet owner to a broker. What advice would you give me? Man, I love this because so often people come into brokerage with absolutely no background and they're able to succeed. But then you get someone who's spent 10 years or whatever in the industry just on the other side, and they're thinking about, like, what do I got to worry about here? What do I have to, what are the big things I have to think about, and what should I do? They have such an advantage, right? They already have relationships with shippers and receivers, probably from frequently being there. They might even have direct customers already. So they already have that, and they understand what does a driver want, right? What matters to a driver? Those are like the super important things. So what I would do is continue to, Now, when someone says, I want to stop, I want to transition to brokering, I'm going to tell you, don't just jump ship right away. It should be a slow, like, bring the dock or bring the boat close to the dock and then step over instead of jumping, right? So this could be you get your authority, or maybe you set up as an agent for a licensed brokerage and you're on an agency. Keep your trucking company operating, and then start to have conversations with your customers about brokerage opportunities as well, right? Hey, I know I've only got 3 trucks and we only service, flatbed freight in this region, but if you guys have stuff that requires a drive-in or a reefer or whatever else, I can now still be your single point of contact, but be able to broker out third party to a trusted carrier that I can vet out that would do the job just as good as me if I was the one doing it. In addition, if you're not already working directly with shippers, I'd probably talk to some brokers out there, like the last question we got, and ask them, what is it like being the sales force in this industry, right? Because carriers, especially small carriers, can just rely on load boards. Just go get freight that way. What would you say? Small fleet looking to transition to brokerage. What's your advice for that person?
My first is, you mentioned it, is I would talk to my existing customers and I would call through them and I would talk to them exactly what you said and say, hey, we're going to be expanding into the brokerage market. We wanted to know what and if we might be able to provide service-wise outside of the lanes we've been running, right? But again, and I'm doing this now, right? Like work for an asset side and the brokerage side. I make almost all of my phone calls from the asset side. And the reason for that is the receptiveness, their willingness to give you information is far different when you have a truck than when you don't have any trucks whatsoever, right? So for me, if you are a small fleet owner, even once your brokerage is open, I kind of would make the calls from the asset side at first. And you want to gauge if there is more need for what you can provide for them. If the need's not there, regardless of it's where you've run or it's another area of the country, that's the cue to they need more brokerage, right? It's either time or in an area where they can't find trucks is usually the one or two things they're going to need first, right? And again, those conversations are just much easier to have with your existing customers that you're already talking to and ask them. And here's something else too. And I was going to do a video on this recently, but I'm noticing, right, like the questions, and this is something that's always been true, but it's becoming more prevalent with my verbiage. What you say and what you ask will greatly determine what you get back, which sounds really obvious. But what you'll notice is as a trucking company, they get pigeonholed, and I'll use we, right? Like into the area or demographic you've always run. So which means when you call that shipper and you go, hey, I'm looking to see if you guys needed help in any other areas where we might not have been able to. In their mind, they've already categorized you as either the commodity or the area of the country where you run, because that's what most trucking companies do. Even the largest ones don't run everywhere all the time. So they'll be like, oh, this guy's an Illinois carrier, a Texas carrier. They'll just talk to you about Illinois or Texas freight. And the same thing will happen with a brokerage. So one of the biggest things we work on with training brokers is the conversations you're having are different than you would have if you're a trucking company. You've got to ask more open-ended questions. You've got to lead your person you're speaking to think about you differently. And one of the ways I do that, just a simple one, is like I'll cue them. Like I know they're going to pigeonhole the asset company into that region. So the thing I will say before I ask them this question is, hey, look, and I know you guys have always kind of looked at the same areas. We've been running most of the same lanes, but we do have customers all the way out to California, all the way down to Florida, and all the way up to Massachusetts. In fact, we picked up a few that I know are outside the regions we've run for you. I'm only saying that because I was curious if there's any other areas we might be able to help you. And you will be astounded at how much the conversation shifts when you basically prompt them with more information. It really works similar to like ChatGPT, right? Like if you prompt it differently, you get a different answer. And human beings aren't that much different in the sense that like they'll think about you the way they always have until you give them a reason to think differently.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I like that. I've had the last piece of advice I would give somebody in that realm is if you're going to do them concurrently, like I would recommend, you have to understand that if you've got to put the time and effort into the brokerage if you want to succeed. I've seen small fleets that say, hey, we're going to, they went the agent route. Sometimes they get their own authority and they try to have somebody wear two hats. You're going to book our trucks primary, and then secondary is go out there and broker out additional freight. Well, if there's not someone whose primary job is to run that brokerage, it's never going to succeed. Never. So keep that in mind.
I want to add something to that. The other thing is, again, trucks and asset companies work on a more predictable standpoint, right? Like what is going to happen a few days from now or next week, right? Brokerages are exactly the opposite. Our value add to shippers in the market is being there when they need us, where they need us, right? So if you're going to expect to be able to call your same customers and they're going to give you loads to move on your brokerage a couple days from now or a week from now, that's not going to happen. If your customers that are working with you on the asset side have a brokerage need, that need will arise the moment it happens and will usually need a truck booked or at least committed to the moment that need is, which means the guy you talk to or the gal you talk to every week, a couple times a week about what's happening next week is not the same cadence or the same time of your conversation. You've got to be there when they need you. And that could be any moment between when they open and when they close throughout that whole week, which is far different than your availability to answer the phone to book a truck. You can book your trucks. Once they're booked, you can go about doing whatever else you need and not really worry about things until a driver has an issue. If you're a broker, you've got to be there answering your emails and your phone pretty much 24/7. And that's, again, to Nate's point, if you don't have somebody full-time monitoring your emails and your phones, as soon as you actually create the opportunity from your customers, there's nobody there to capitalize on it. You get the email 2-3 hours later, that shipper's already found a broker to work with them. They've already got the truck secured and they're on their way to the next thing. These aren't things that you can get to a day later like you could if you had an asset company.
That's exactly right. Very good point. Okay, our final question today is about high value freight. So I have a potential customer looking to ship single skids. Skid is another word for pallet. Ship single skids worth $1.5 million each. How do I get this done? The problem is cargo insurance. Well, I'll tell you that we've done stuff worth way more than $1.5 million. We've done stuff worth $20 to $30 million, high value stuff. And insurance is obviously a hot topic here. So single skid, $1.5 million. Well, if you're going to be, there's a couple ways to do it, right? If you're going to go through an LTL company, I don't know if I would risk that because damages are more often. I'd probably try to get like a Sprinter van or box truck company and purchase an all risk policy, which would cover the full amount of that load. And so like we had LoadSure on, they're a partner of DAT, and I use them personally. Single load insurance policy. You get your quote and policy in like 45 seconds. It's super easy. But what it does is we're not relying on a carrier's insurance policy anymore. We're the primary first position when it comes to the policy. So the claims, if there is one, is settled within 30 days. So the good news is claim is settled fast. Number two, we have the full coverage for that. Number three, we control the policy, right? Whereas a carrier has to, if you're going to tell them, hey, we need $1.5 million and they only have 100,000, they got to go out and shop with their insurance for a spike policy or whatever it might be. And then you don't know what the actual cost is. They might just tell you, I need an extra $3,000 on this for insurance. You've got transparency on your end if you're the one buying the policy. Have you ever done anything high value like that?
Yes, and I always use something similar to LoadSure with spike insurance to the brokerage or something in the first position to that point, because that's a big number, right?
Yeah.
And again, I don't really want that risk out there on the carrier side at that number without speaking to the person, the rep giving me that insurance policy. And especially if you're in a smaller company, you don't have like attorneys that you can reach out to, because this could absolutely bankrupt just about any kind of size brokerage to some degree. I mean, LoadSure is exactly where my brain goes to. You're not going to get a carrier that is going to have this amount of insurance and cargo probably ever. And even if they, I can't think of any example of any carriers, even that do high value often, that probably have
not that high, and not for one pallet. Because like I said, you're going to probably use a Sprinter van or a box truck company because you want it dedicated. You don't want to push it through the LTL network, and you're not going to waste a full truckload. or
and you want to make
have
sure
it
this
partial with somebody else's stuff.
right, and you really want to make sure that this insurance coverage is paid out, right?
Yeah.
In addition to just it being there.
Yep.
So yeah.
Good question, though. And as always, continue to send us your questions, and we will answer them every week on the Final Mile from Freight 360. Ben, any final thoughts before we sign off today?
Whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right.
And until next time, go Bills.